what are some of the, now we've, so the US election system is a complex system. It has elements of path dependency and path independency in it. What are some of the problems of forecasting in these systems, right? When we talk about predictions and forecasts, and again, the US election is a great example for all complex systems, because what I'm going to say here applies to not just the elections, but all systems. First, George Box has this famous quote. He's a mathematician. All models are wrong. Some are useful. When we create a simulation of model the real world, we're not creating the real world. We can't, by definition, recreate the entirety of the real world, because if we did, we'd just use the real world. We're always making choices of abstraction and design and what kind of data we have, or what access, or what resources or limitations we have. All models are a series of choices that are basically saying we're going to take the entirety of reality and simplify it to be able to make a useful prediction. And that's why it's true. All models are wrong. You'll never find a perfectly right model of a complex system. The question is whether they are useful, because I don't need to model every single individual voter to be able to make a forecast on the US election. I mean, that would be incredibly difficult to do, and the chances of error would be high, and it probably wouldn't be any much better than a simpler model. But another challenge is, unlike, the US election, any sort of single event, you can't run a double-blind placebo in the real world. With a medical trial, you can give, if you have a medicine, like say we get a vaccine for the coronavirus, we can say half the patients get the vaccine, half don't. We're going to do a double-blind placebo test. We'll see how they do. You can't split the US in half and have half run a real election and half run a fake election. You can't. This is why modeling complex systems is used. We use simulations because in the real world, we can't run a double-blind test. We can only do it once. We have one shot. But in a simulation, you can run as many tests as you want because it's all synthetic. It's all in the simulation. And this gets to another point, is that in the real world, you could never run an experiment the same way twice. Think about all the things that were in place in 2019 when the presidential campaign started between the Democratic contenders, seeing who would go up against President Trump, right? Even if you froze that at a point in time, first of all, you probably couldn't replicate all the factors that would happen to be able to run that again a second time as an experiment. Second, different things might happen, right? Different events in the world might happen or not happen, and very small changes. And this is where, Ms. Falconberry, the concept of chaos comes in. Seemingly small changes throughout the complex system means that second experiment, that second run through, could have very different outcomes, because you can't run the same test twice. You can never recreate the conditions. You can never isolate all the conditions. And finally, unique events are unique. This is the challenge of calling something like the presidential election. It only is going to happen once on November 3rd. It's not a series. If there were 100 presidential elections, you could make a more useful prediction of saying that, we're going to have, there's of these 100 elections, so many percent of them are going to go one way and so many percent are going the other. But there's only one election. It only happens once. So probability becomes tricky, because what are you giving a probability on? And this gets into this question of some more problems with forecasting before I get into the question of the probability. In a complex system, you have to ask which feedback loops are dominant. Remember that path dependent versus path independent? Well, if you have positive or compounding feedback loops that are dominant in a system, that means things are going to double over the doubling period. It's that like compounding interest, right? Or compounding growth. Things are doubling at a constant rate. The question is, what's your error margin? Because an error margin is a component of that system, and if everything's doubling at the doubling rate of the period, then your error margin is going to double too. So if you start out with a prediction that has only a 0.5% of an error margin, but the doubling rate of the system is weekly, that means every week your error margin is going to double from 0.5% to 1% to 2% to 4% per 8% per 16%. Pretty soon you have an error margin so large, your model's not very useful. And this is why we can't predict the weather more than a few days out. It's positive feedback loop dominant in the local conditions of the environment. Now, climatologically speaking, we can say there's probably more balancing feedback loops, but certainly in local weather, it's very hard to predict more than a few days out because of this doubling effect. Likewise, stock market, no one can predict the stock market because of this. Even if you had a very, very small error margin, very quickly it would be doubled to the point where your error margin's effectively 1. This is different from a negative feedback loop system where instead of a doubling effect, you have a halving effect over time. And that means your error margin is also halving over time. And this is why, for example, when we do carbon half-life dating, that's a system dominated by balancing feedback. The radioactive decay of the material is a balancing feedback loop, and the error margin halves, which is why we can date things tens of thousands of years in the past pretty accurately, but can't predict the stock market a month from now. It's because the two systems that we're dealing with are dominated by different kinds of feedback loops. And understanding these feedback loops, the US presidential election, it's a human system. Most human systems are dominated by positive feedback loop. The presidential election is no different. And so some of the things that forecasters do to mitigate this is they'll sample frequently. They won't rely on a forecast made months in advance. They'll regularly sample in those opinion polls. But you have to be very careful and aware that any of these predictions in a system like the US election are going to have that error margin. The longer it goes from when that prediction is made, the higher that error margin is going to be. Now, appreciate your time today. If you have any questions on structured systems thinking, have a problem you'd like our help on, or want to know more about developing your own capabilities in systems thinking, please reach out at the email below. We'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in what we do and want to follow our journey, I've added our LinkedIn and Twitter information. And we plan to regularly update this channel with quick tips and case studies to help you get the most out of your systems thinking and lean efforts. If you want to be notified whenever we add new video content, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the red subscribe button below this video.